Welcome to Tabletop Tommies, episode 12. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're going to be talking about terrain, the do's and don'ts, how to set up a table, how to make your table look amazing and play amazing. Let's jump straight in. Phil, what's the most important thing, in your opinion, when it comes to terrain?
I think for me, it needs to look the part, but not by sacrificing how it plays.
Okay, when you say look the part, what do you mean? Do you mean sort of the structure of the terrain has to be suitable? It has to be in the right setting, has to be the right paint. What are we talking here?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about the paint. I think I would say it is about the right setting. You know, we play a game where we spend a lot of time painting our models. We want to, and we take time and care and attention over getting them to look nice. And I'd like that to be reflected in the table that I'm playing on. And I want it to work as a theme. So if I'm playing on a Normandy board, I don't really want to have a pyramid in the corner next to a row of French houses and a boulangerie and a patisserie, because that pyramid is going to look a bit out of place.
I do agree. Ultimately, how it looks is a huge part. And when I'm choosing terrain, when I'm choosing where I'm going to buy it from, sort of what is available is often the top criteria. So if I'm looking at someone like Charlie Foxtrot, like they've got a really good range of Normandy stuff. So if I'm looking for Normandy, I'll go on their website and look at exactly what they've got. Because you're right, I'm trying to build a table that's representative of one area. I'm not going to throw in sand dunes in Normandy, for example.
Yeah, unless it's off the beach. Yeah, I think when I first started playing Bolt Action and I was playing at home with my mates, I was picking up bits and pieces of terrain, from all over the place, getting it cheap off eBay and that sort of thing. And that was absolutely fine as I was learning the game and getting my head around the rules and so on. Then when I started to think about creating a table that I could use at events, I then started, like you said, started looking at what was available from different manufacturers. Which manufacturers work together as well, because obviously there's so many different scales out there. If you take something like a $4,000 building, which looks absolutely lovely, incredibly detailed, you put it alongside something like Empires at War, and I've got quite a few of the Empires at War buildings. They are very much on the smaller side, and it just looks out of place if you're mixing and matching certain manufacturers that don't go together. So as I've started to put tables together, which I can use at events, and also as I've started to put together tables for the club, I look at, what's available in terms of manufacturers. And like you said, what kind of theme do I want? Is it a desert table? Is it a jungle table? Is it a rural table? Is it going to be a Stalingrad ruins? Is it going to be Normandy? Is it going to be, Pacific Beach and so on? But my key point, going right back to what I said at the start, was I don't want the visual quality to impact on the gameplay, because, you can create some fantastic looking tables. And, there's lots of people out there on YouTube and, Reddit and so on who produce the most amazing looking tables. But I can't imagine they're going to be fun to play on, because there's a blur between where does one piece of terrain end and another begin. Is it clear, boundaries of dense terrain, all that sort of stuff. And, we are playing a game, but it would be nice if it looks good as well. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, with what you're saying about getting them all the same scale, I find Warlord do a lot of the Italieri stuff that's 1/70 seconds, and it's one of the problems I have with the walls, when the walls are so short and then people are saying, well, that doesn't give cover to this vehicle, let's say.
Yeah.
And so I always tend to, if someone's using those walls, I tend to make an agreement beforehand what will and what won't behind, because they're not a regular size wall for a human at that scale.
Yeah.
But actually, for myself, the aesthetics of the table is very much the same reason I paint the army. I'm not painting the army for myself, because actually I just enjoy playing the game, and so I don't mind playing sort of two grey armies against each other, because to me they're kind of just pieces that represent something. However, if I'm putting a table together, it's in the same way I paint my army. It's because basically it's sort of a respect for your opponent. You turn up with a fully painted army at tournaments, and if I'm putting a table together at a club, I'm going to make sure that it looks the part, because otherwise it shows that you didn't really put the effort in. Like, you didn't think it was worth the effort to make the game look good as well as sort of play good. But as I say, from my perspective, I'm quite happy playing. Sort of back in the day when I got started wargaming, we used to just sort of pile up books on the kitchen table. They were buildings, and then you'd have maybe, I can't remember what we'd use as walls. maybe it's a ruler or something out the old school bag and then prop it up on the edge of the building.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just use basically whatever was to hand
Mm-hmm.
and then just sort of your imagination. For me, the game mechanics are the key feature. And so while I totally agree with the aesthetics, you have to make sure it's on point for the sake of your opponent. I try to always avoid letting that impact the game.
Yeah.
One of the examples I know is sort of that irks you as well is the edges of dense terrain. If someone throws sort of sand down on the edge of a forest to nicely obscure it so it looks really nice because it just sort of blends into the feature, but then you can't see the edge of it.
Yeah. And the reason it irks me is because it's a very critical game mechanic.
Yeah.
In terms of, the edge of dense terrain has a massive impact as to whether or not something's in cover, whether or not it's rough ground, and therefore it's moving at, 6 inches or 12 for an infantry. It also has a massive impact in terms of assaults.
Yeah.
So if it didn't really matter whether or not, this ruin or this wood ended at a certain point from outside of a game mechanic, then fine, put sand down and rubble and so on. But it absolutely does matter because of the way that terrain interacts with other rules and game mechanics.
Absolutely, yeah. We've sort of covered there what we think is the most important thing. Make sure it looks good, but not at the detriment of gameplay.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
Nicely segueing into gameplay and game mechanics, the three things that I consider are sort of the density of the terrain, the variety, and the positioning of it. Those are sort of your three key mechanics, aren't they?
Yeah. I was pausing because I'm interested to hear what you have to say, particularly around variety, but go on.
So specifically what I mean by the variety then is if you play on a table with just one type of terrain, it doesn't often lead to the best game. I have done it before where I've played on a table with just woods, and it was a surprisingly enjoyable game because everything was dead easy. There was no arguments about like how this cover interacts with this cover and how does this unit get cover in it, because everything was a wood and we know how to play woods. And so it was really easy, but it was a bit samey. It was probably a good tournament game, I'd say, but it's a bit bland for thematic and sort of club games to just have woods.
Okay.
So I think generally you should have some soft obstacles, something like a hedge, some hard obstacles, something like a wall. You should have some dense terrain that's soft like a wood, and some dense terrain that's hard like a ruined house, a house that's bombed out, let's say if we're in Normandy. That's what I think. I think because also it gives you, when you're deploying, you're like, do I go to the side of the table where actually it's easier for me to advance, but I only get soft cover the whole way up? Or do I go to the side where it's a bit more faffy, like my wheeled vehicles have to turn more, but they've got hard cover most of the way up? And so it's giving you options that you have to consider as you're controlling your force, which is why I like that sort of variety in a game. Do you disagree with my variety decision? Is that why you are very keen to listen in?
I don't disagree because the example you gave, a Normandy board where you've got some bombed out farmhouses, so you've got your hard dense cover, you've got some woods, you've got some hedges, you've got some walls, you've got a building and so on. That works. I'm immediately thinking about your Stalingrad sort of table where there weren't many trees in Stalingrad, certainly not after they bombed it.
Yeah.
So, you're not going to get soft, dense cover, for example, on a themed, Stalingrad table. It's going to be very much walls and ruins and, hard cover, dense, and so on. Likewise, if you're thinking about, jungle terrain, if you're doing a Pacific beach assault, you're going to have those hard points because, you could model the Japanese, machine gun emplacements and trench lines and that sort of thing. If you're doing a Burmese jungle and it's sort of the Chindits, behind enemy lines, long range patrols, that sort of thing, you're not going to have, a load of emplacements and so on, because that wasn't the kind of action that was going on for the Chindits in Burma at that time. So I think you can have nice looking tables that work thematically that don't need to have all of the types of terrain. And I think it makes for a very different game. I've certainly played on, sticking on that sort of Burma jungle theme. I've played on tables before where there's been a lot of, dense jungle type terrain, and then the wooden huts. And we've ruled it that the wooden huts have been soft cover, because they're paper thin, bamboo leaves, palm leaves, all that sort of stuff. Which means your infantry, particularly, are obviously not getting a lot of cover. So you've got to think a bit more about, well, where am I going to put them? They're not going to be as as hardy behind, everything that's soft cover than they would be if they were, peeking out from behind a wall or, the corner of a building in Normandy where they're getting hard cover. So I think it has an impact on how the game plays as well.
Yeah, I think obviously there's exceptions to every rule. That's what makes it a rule. But
Yeah.
I think of the 4 types we've listed there, I do think it's possible to put 3 in every case.
Yeah.
So with your Stalingrad one, you can have dense hard cover because you've got ruins. You can have soft cover, which is like crates or a wooden fence. And then your hard cover is obviously something like rubble or a stone wall. It's hard to get the dense soft, obviously, in that one, because you're not getting much woods. There's probably cases you could make for it, like if you had loads of crates stacked up, you could say, well, they're not going to be hard cover, they're just soft, dense. You probably could make a bit of a case to if you really did want to have one of everyone. But if you've got sort of 3, you're close enough because you've lent into the style that I don't think anyone's going to begrudge you the lack of the 4th one.
Yeah.
And your jungle one, again, there are opportunities there, because even if you don't put emplacements in, what you could do is put sort of like craters in, and then that allows you to put in sort of like hard cover, because you could say, this infantry can jump in the crater and use that in the same way you would a wall.
Yeah.
And so I think there are ways you can add them, even to sort of very one-note tables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. I'll give you that. Yep.
Yeah, but I think you're right, like, none of the sort of the things we say are going to be hard and fast rules, I don't think, because there's always going to be exceptions, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that was the sort of the variety note, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And on that note, like we said earlier, when I'm building a table, everything has to have a function. I never put anything on that doesn't serve a function, because it just takes away from the opportunity to have a very clean game. Because that's one of the things that I think makes the game the most enjoyable and easy to play, is if you have very clean, clear-cut terrain.
Okay. What kind of examples are you thinking of where there may be stuff that muddies the water a bit?
Well, we've already covered the one where you sort of throw down some scatter, like sand or rubble. The other one that I see a lot is one tree.
Yes.
So what is that? Is that going to give me soft cover if my men conga line behind it?
Yeah.
That one's just a bit of a faff. And equally, actually, on that note, even 3 trees, but without a base.
Yeah.
Now, if it's dense, where's its edge? All it does, it leads to the players having to come to an agreement. And then because you're sort of coming to an agreement, especially if it's at a tournament, you're sort of racing to get the game started. You make this agreement, and then later on, someone will probably forget what the agreement was. And then there's an opportunity there to end up having sort of a back and forth about what you originally agreed, how it would normally be played, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And so, I think if you're doing trees, give them a base and make it dense terrain.
Yeah.
If not, make it a bush so it's a soft obstacle.
Yeah, standalone trees, if there ever was a bugbear for me within bolt action terrain, it's probably going to be standalone trees. And quite often, if the opponent agrees and I'm playing, somewhere that isn't my club or I'm not playing on a table that I've put together, I'll often say that's purely there for aesthetics. It has no impact on the actual mechanics of the game, because otherwise it's like, is my infantryman in a conga line behind that tree as you look at him? And then we get into the whole 50% of the shooters and 50% of the target unit. And I'm like, I'll just ignore it. A tree that's in the middle of a hedge line, that's fine. It's just soft cover. It's part of that linear soft cover, within the hedge.
Yeah. 100%. And on that note as well, actually, the other reason the solo trees are big bugbears, because you invariably knock them over at least once a turn.
Yeah.
And then you have to pick it up, or it just ends up on the side of the table anyway, because you get so sick of knocking it over and picking it up that and trying to remember exactly where it was.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about yet, speaking of variety, is roads. What are your thoughts on roads, Phil? Do you like them?
Yeah, so roads, quite happy to have them on the table. I think you're going to be the same here. I don't like it when you put a load of roads down and then you block them every, 12, 15, 18 inches, because you're not really gaining the benefit of having that road. I'm not saying that you should have a road that goes from your table edge to the opponent's table edge unhindered or impeded. I think there needs to be something to stop you from just racing across the board. But you can do that by putting in some kinks in the road, and putting in some bends, so that your tracked vehicle that only has one turn on the advance is not going to be able to shoot up the board, even if it's moving on a road, because it lacks the turns to do it. So yeah, no problem with roads. I'd rather they didn't just go straight across the table, from your edge to their edge. Equally, what I tend to do is I might put a bit of an obstacle across 2/3 of the road or half the road,
Mm-hmm.
so that my vehicle is not going to be able to just steamroller down the road because the vehicle's bigger than the footprint available to it. It's forcing me to navigate around that obstacle, but I'm going to get some advantage from moving along the road because of the double movement available to me and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. I think with roads, aesthetically, I think they look better when they're not straight across the table anyway. If they're sort of at some angle, even if it's not a big angle, just sort of 10 degrees is enough, really. That solves that mechanics problem that a wheeled vehicle can't just go the entire length of the table in one turn. And yes, I also think one of my big bugbears is if you block the road, as you say, sort of every foot, then what was the point in putting it down? Because no one's going to get any benefit from going on it. And especially if you line the road with fences and hedges and stuff, because then it really is a pointless place to go. Because if you put a wheeled vehicle there, or even a tracked vehicle, it can't run out of that situation. It just becomes a bit of a dead area, basically. You might as well have just put a black hole down if you're going to do that. So I think, much like you, I totally agree. Rather than blocking the roads entirely, you put limitations on the road due to the maneuverability of the vehicles. So yeah, add those kinks, make it diagonal, especially if you have it like going around something that would make sense. Like on my desert table, I'll often have the road going around sort of like a rocky outcrop that obviously the road builders just thought it's easier to go around than to demolish. Or like an oasis or something.
Yeah.
And then what it means, as you say, like the wheeled vehicle, yes, you can race down it, but he can't race down it in one turn.
Yeah.
One of the things I like actually is if you're going to put shell splats on your road and your road is wide enough, let's say it's like 2 cars wide, if you put the shell splats on one side and then 12 inches down, it's on the other side of the road. The road you can still use, but because you're having to sort of slalom down it, again, it limits the maneuverability of your... it limits your movement because of the maneuverability of your vehicles, which I think is the best way to do it. Yeah, it is really is a bugbear when people put roads down and then just make them unusable. Waste of everyone's time.
I think it's going to link a bit as well to symmetry.
Yeah.
If we just kind of segue from roads into symmetry, because I firmly believe that the table doesn't need to be symmetrical. And I mean that in a number of different ways. I like a table that isn't exactly broken into quarters and whereby you haven't got, right, this table edge has got 2 pieces of hard cover and 1 soft dense terrain, and I'm going to put 2 pieces of hard cover and a dense terrain in the other table edge. I'm perfectly fine with having random combinations of soft and hard cover and dense and so on. I don't think it needs to be equally distributed across the board or across the sectors. But obviously you don't want an imbalance where one person's got all the terrain on their side of the table and the other person has got a few scatterings of random singular trees and a road going across from their side to the other side with no obstacles in between.
That leads nicely onto sort of the positioning point where I don't mind playing on a perfectly symmetrical table. That's fine, but I do enjoy when they are asymmetrical, and that is part of the tactics where the roll off, you picking sides, and there actually is a purpose to picking sides. That's quite fun. That adds a little bit of fun to the original roll, because quite often if they are perfectly symmetrical, well, you're just going to stay on the side that you currently stood at, aren't you? And there's no strategy there.
There's often no reason to swap sides.
And so the position of the terrain, you want to make sure that it doesn't have to be symmetrical, but you do want to make sure that there is terrain sort of semi-evenly scattered so that, as you said, you don't want one side fully loaded and the other side not fully loaded. On that note, my sort of rule of thumb is if you draw a 48-inch straight line anywhere on the table, it should cross something. So that could be like a soft obstacle, it could be dense, but it should cross some piece of terrain, because what that means is that you haven't got any fire lines where you can shoot sort of 60 inches with no cover at all.
Yeah.
Because I think that doesn't lead to a fun game, because what it allows you to do is you plonk that 88 down and someone's going to have to run past it at some point. And everyone knows that, and there's no strategy there. Whereas if the 88 is going to be blocked at 4 foot in all directions, if you're playing against it, it means you're having to make that tactical decision like, am I going to go this way where it's further away but I've got soft, or I'm going to go closer where I might get the hard cover, but obviously I'm closer range then, so they're going to balance out. So now I have to think about, once I get past that point. And so that's my rule of thumb. 48 inches, you should cross something.
Yeah, and that's reasonable. And, I think to be fair, most people, when they're putting together their tables, especially for events and tournaments and so on, they will spend time looking at it and going, okay, where are the lines of sight? Where's the uninterrupted line of sight? What can I do to prevent that uninterrupted line of sight? And sometimes it might be like, do you know what? That's fine. It's just a quirk of the table, and you have to play around it when you're actually playing on it. But you don't want, like you said, tables where you've just got massive sight lines running, across the board, straight lines on a diagonal, and all sorts going on.
Yeah. And one of the things people think to fix that is, well, we'll just throw more stuff on.
Yeah.
That seems like the easy solution. And this leads us back to sort of the original point that I'm thinking about, which is density. Like, how much is enough and how much is too much? Now, just throwing more stuff on, yes, you'll fulfill that criteria of you can't draw a 4-foot line without crossing something. But you might have made it so dense that there's no movement game going to happen because there's just terrain piled on terrain. And this is why sort of the positioning and the density go hand in hand, where I think actually a good rule would be to have the minimum amount of terrain positioned in a way such that you can't draw that 4-foot line without cover.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think really you probably want the minimum terrain, because then that allows sort of your troops to do the runs and your wheeled vehicles to get across the table. One of the things I find really frustrating, obviously I play a lot of wheeled vehicles, so I'm going to find this frustrating, but...
We didn't know that, Johnny, that you played lots of dodges. No.
But if you build a table where there's one place for wheeled vehicles to cross...
Yeah.
Now, obviously I take it to the extreme and I'll run maybe 6 wheeled vehicles. Most armies will have at least one. But if you build, I don't know, that river board with one crossing, well, you know where my wheeled vehicle's going to cross, and so you can just sit your anti-tank gun on ambush, and you've got a guaranteed kill if my mission was to get across that bridge.
Yeah. We talked about this in the first episode when we did our review of the Welsh Nationals.
Yeah.
As my third game, so the last game of the first day, I had that situation where I had 2 wheeled vehicles. I had an armoured car and I had a Jeep with a flamethrower in it. And there was only one point across the entire width of my table edge that a wheeled vehicle could get out of my deployment zone, because the rest of that side of the table, there was effectively, 2 continuous hedges. There was a hedge from one side up to the road. There was the gap where the road was. And then there was basically a hedge to another part of the table, and then it went into a churchyard. And what happened to me in my game was that my armoured car basically blocked the road. I think it got taken out on like turn 2, which meant that my Jeep with my flamethrower in it, yes, it could come onto the table, but it couldn't actually get out the field. So it was just kind of like driving around, like, doing donuts in the field, waiting to do something. And obviously my opponent didn't bring his infantry anywhere near me, so he couldn't get out and start flaming it. So
yeah. That's exactly the kind of stuff we're talking about, isn't it? Where when you have those bottlenecks, it takes away from the strategy because it tells your opponent what you're going to do because it's the only choice you have.
Yeah.
And I don't like that. I think you should have 3 paths for wheeled vehicles to get up. Because as I say, most people are running at least one armoured car with wheels or one truck with wheels. And you and your opponent basically should do the sort of like a bit of a bluff where, I'm going to try and make them think that my armoured car's going to go up this avenue, and actually I'm going to send them this way, and sort of vice versa. If the opponent has an anti-tank gun, I want them to have to commit to one of the 3 avenues. Basically, I want to have something to think about. Yeah. If there's only one avenue, no one's doing any thinking there. We're just rolling dice.
Yeah, and in the game I'm referring to, my opponent won the dice roll to choose size. He had a couple of wheeled vehicles. He obviously, looked at the table and went, "I'm not having that side." Pick the table edge that worked for him, and also recognise, well, I know exactly where Phil's going to bring his wheeled vehicle on. So yeah, totally fair play in that situation, but kind of my hand was forced a little bit because of how the table was set up.
If the table had been symmetrical, it might not have happened.
Touche.
Yeah, I can't remember where did we start with that, Phil?
We were talking about lines of fire and density and maneuverability, and then you went in to talk about we can get far too crowded in our table, and it's particularly a problem if you're talking about wheeled vehicles and crossing. And I was thinking, as you were saying that rivers are a similar thing, aren't they?
Yeah,
you can get some lovely looking rivers, and we can think about, so many examples from, World War II of river crossings and that kind of thing. But if you've only got one point where you can cross it,
Yeah.
from the game mechanics perspective, it's like, oh, okay. I'm thinking about, the Pegasus Bridge boards.
Yeah.
The Sarissa Pegasus Bridge is an absolutely lovely model, and I've been to an event where one of the boards was the Pegasus Bridge, and the river ran slap bang in a line through the middle of the board, either side of the 24 inches mark. Pegasus Bridge was slap bang in the middle, 36 inches in from either side, and it was like, okay. And I didn't play on it, but I've been at the event, and I was just thinking, if you're playing like double envelopment on that kind of table,
Yeah.
where are you going to go with that?
Well, you're not playing double envelopment at that point. You're playing meet engagement, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
On that note, actually, you've just made us think of two things there. The first one was, I often think rivers are like roads in terms of the placement. The best rivers go diagonally and sort of wind around, because what that allows you to do, and also they should have 2 crossings minimum, and that allows you, if you are coming on, let's say, first wave or from reserve, you can either come on sort of on your table edge behind the river, which means you have to go the crossing, or you can come on sort of their side of the river on your table edge. That's really nice. And again, it's really nice because strategically what your opponent can then do is they can place their anti-tank gun sort of watching their side of the river on your table edge, if you see what I mean, which might force your hand to come on your side of the river and then go over it. One of my things for rivers is I do like when they're winding, and that is one of the problems with the Pegasus one, because I believe that was a very straight river where the actual bridge is, isn't it? So that was my first thing I was thinking. The other thing I was thinking there when you were saying it was slap bang in the middle, I've been to a tournament where the TO had set up all these tables, loads of tables, lots of brilliant terrain. But one of the things they'd done was they'd set up every single road went across the middle of the table.
Yeah.
And that kind of makes sense because it makes it nice and fair because the road is directly in the middle. But what it did mean is when you got to the table, you knew exactly where the middle of the table was.
Yeah.
I remember I was playing someone and I did an outflank, brought my unit on turn 3, placed the Dodge truck on the road. I might have been a Brent carrier, I might have been playing Brits. I placed it on the road. And they said, well, you're not going to measure that. And I was like, oh, actually, I probably should, but I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet quite a bit of money that road is exactly 24 inches onto the table. And sure enough, it was, because the same person set up every single table.
Okay.
And actually, on that note, what I find is you get into habits, don't you, when you're setting up tables?
Yeah.
And so one of the things, actually, for tournaments and stuff that's really good is if you have a few people setting up tables, that allows you to have variety in your layouts without you having to think too hard. Because I think one person will always make sort of the same layout over and over, won't they?
Yeah, I'm thinking about when I've taken tables to events. I'll do it at home first. I'll kind of lay it out at home and work out what works and hopefully try and play a game on it. And then I'll have that in mind when I take it to an event to use, whoever's TOing it. If that same table appears at another event later on in the year, I will rearrange it so I'm not just replicating it, especially because, if you're talking about like 2-day events, it's quite often you've got similar faces turning up, so you do get to see similar tables appearing because, the same people are playing at the same events and bringing, their table in the box type situation.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it is a good point. I think we all will naturally lean towards, 1 or 2 ways of setting our tables up. So if you have got, 2 or 3 different people setting up tables at an event, they're going to look at it in a different way.
Yeah, it's one of the things with the modular terrain where you've got sort of roads in segments rather than a continuous road that goes all the way across. Because you can see the breaks in the road, you lose a little bit on the aesthetics. But what it does mean is if you just throw those road pieces down randomly, it gives you a random layout for the road. Whereas if you use those fabric rolls, which I think look quite good, because they haven't got any breaks in them, and they do some nice cobbled ones. The problem is it's always going to be the same shape, that road. That's where the modular ones are quite good. Yeah, because I've got a desert one like that where I 3D printed the hills and stuff to go down the edges. And every time, and this is partly just because I haven't chosen an exact layout, but every time you just sort of throw these hills out, and sometimes they're down the edges, sometimes they're down the long edges. I say hills, I mean sand dunes, really. Sometimes they're down the side edges. Sometimes you can even push them all together and make sort of like a rocky outcrop sand dune thing in the middle of the table, which changes the game entirely. And generally, as you say, it's a battlefield in a box, if you will. And I'll bring it and then we'll just sort of throw it down and then get it so it makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, what else should we talk about with the terrain, Phil?
So the last one I wanted to raise before we look at rules
Yeah.
is when you block off one side of a table with a terrain feature. And they look good when this happens. So, jumping back to my first point about I want my table to look good. I'm thinking of last year at the Welsh Open. There was a lovely table which had the Sarissa Reichstag building, which essentially is the entire length of one small side of a table. But it meant that, you're obviously not going to be outflanking or doing anything from that side because there's a building in the way.
Yeah.
Another example would be if you did a beach landing or a port raid and you're playing, with the sea, as it were, on your right or left-hand side. So on one of the short sides, again, you're kind of cutting off a part of that board. Something I'm looking to do, hopefully this year, but it might end up being next year. I 3D printed a German U-boat, and it's amazing because I really want to build a sort of Saint Nazaire, so the Commando Radar Saint Nazaire. I really want to build some kind of German, port U-boat pen type situation. But this U-boat, if I put it together, it's 39 inches long. So, that would take out the entire, short edge of one side of the table. And obviously, because it's printed in sections, I'm then thinking, I could have it in two halves next to each other, coming out from one side of the table, into the middle of the board. Yeah. And then I've just got to work out how to make some pens and all that kind of stuff. I think it will look really good, but I've just shut off a massive part of the gaming area because I put a big, Reichstag building or a U-boat or, I've got a beach, scenario, beach landing going on.
Yeah, I imagine your U-boat pens won't be so bad because as long as sort of the walkway between them, sort of the concrete pier or whatever it is wide enough that you could maybe fit a truck down it or whatever. Obviously, thematically, it's a bit weird that you've outflanked onto the pier with your truck.
Well, yeah.
But rules-wise, there's nothing to stop the truck coming in that way. And again, when I've seen people do these boards, they tend to have gangplanks that go to the subs, don't they?
Yeah.
So your infantry can still run across the sub.
Yeah.
So I think actually that one's not too bad in that respect.
Yeah.
As long as you don't put those pens exactly halfway up the table.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about it. And actually, jumping on that point, as I've started to kind of, build terrain and put different pieces of terrain together and not quite into dioramas, but certainly into more than just here's a building and I've plonked it, on the table. I'm thinking about dimensions a lot. I'm thinking about the width of the rows or the width of gaps between walls and gates and that kind of thing, because it's no good having a really nice looking terrain piece if functionally it's pretty useless and ends up being impassable, to various units on the board because you just can't get your vehicle around it or whatever it is.
Yeah, that was one of the big things because I've 3D printed that big Stalingrad factory and one of the things, because I designed that from scratch, and one of the things that I considered when I did that was I made all of the doorways are just wider than a Tiger. Partly just I wanted the Tiger to be able to drive through it, but also I just thought it would look really good to have the Tiger just sort of going into the factory and then shooting through the factory at someone's tank down the other end.
Yeah.
The scale of things definitely is something that I've considered in the past. And then there's always the temptation. If you buy a nice big building like a church or something, there's always the temptation to just bang it slap bang in the middle of the table, isn't there?
Yeah,
I'm guilty of this myself. I always put, if I buy a big building like that, because I'm this takes up so much space, I don't want to block the flank, or I don't want to block a table edge, I'll just put it right in the middle. But then of course it means you sort of you end up sort of whirlpooling around it sometimes.
Yeah.
Or people end up avoiding the middle of the table because if the other player has a multi-launcher, that's just you've just given everyone sort of a 18-inch kill zone in the middle of the table.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in passing some rules. What sort of rule stuff did you want to talk about around terrain?
Yeah, so there are three key ones just to highlight. And they, going back to an earlier point, that I don't want a table that looks nice that mucks around with game mechanics.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned dense terrain, and it's really important that it's clear what the edge of the dense terrain is for reasons of movement, cover, assaulting, defended position, all that sort of stuff. Second one is ruins, particularly kind of Stalingrad type boards, because buildings have levels. You have a ground floor, first floor, second floor, and there's clear rules about how you move from one floor to another in a building. Ruins don't have floors in terms of the game. A ruin is effectively a big blob, and it might be modeled as, being 3 stories high, but it's been blown up and there's rubble all over the place. But in game terms, there isn't a ground floor, a first floor, and a second floor, and a third floor. And you often see this where, if you're forward deploying your snipers and your spotters and that kind of thing, somebody might put their sniper at the the fourth floor of a ruined Stalingrad type, house or factory unit.
Yeah.
And as the opponent, I'm like, well, how do I clear that sniper in close assault?
Yeah.
Because, it's not a building. So it's not like I can run up, from ground floor to first floor to second floor, each turn. Strictly speaking, that sniper's position with regards to an assault is on the ground. It's at ground level. But then it's like, well, hang on a minute. If it's 4 stories up, it's got an elevated line of sight. And it all starts to just get a little bit, tricky and unpicking. So, yeah, particularly, another bugbear along with my solitary single trees would be multi-story ruined buildings, especially in Stalingrad type boards, because buildings have levels and there's clear game mechanics about how you move up levels. Ruins don't have levels. They are just big blobs of dense line of sight blocking terrain.
Yeah, when you're in dense terrain, you're on the ground, both in terms of your line of sight and, as you say, for being charged. Rules as written, you're on the ground there.
Yeah.
And so you can put him up there and for like aesthetic reasons, so he looks cool, like he's perched over. Yeah. But rules as written, you're on the ground.
Yeah. Although, just to complicate it, there are particular campaign rules in the Stalingrad book where it does allow you to blow up certain floors of particularly large buildings, but not bring the whole building down. But that's very specific to Stalingrad because it was, the whole tractor factory situation and multi-levels and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about buildings there, not ruins.
Yes. Yeah, it's buildings rather than ruins. Yeah.
You've just reminded me, though, of something else that is a bit of a bugbear. So hills are one of my least favourite forms of terrain because usually they've got sloped side, and so there's not, if you treat them as an obstacle, there's not a really clear cut-off of where the obstacle begins and ends.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I often play with hills is I just play it as dense terrain.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I assume that there's enough sort of undulations on the hill that any unit on there has enough places they can sort of like dip down into cover. And so I'll play it either, depending on sort of how rocky the hill is, I'll either play it as dense soft or dense hard terrain, just because it makes the game so much cleaner than trying to sort of get down. You're stooping down like, oh, well, it's covering his shins at that point, but at this point, so where's the edge of it if it's an obstacle? It's much easier to be like, it's dense, here's the edge of it, easy. Yeah, so that was your ruins and your height. So I know also we have the similar issue with buildings, don't we, where people put stuff on the roofs of buildings?
Yeah, so if you're thinking about, like desert boards, adobe buildings where you've got a ground floor, you've got, a first floor which is open, and strictly speaking in the rule book, what it says is that buildings that don't have roofs, for example, your desert table, that is counted as another floor. So you might have a single story building with a roof. Well, the roof area is the first floor, i.e., the second level of that building.
Oh,
yes, yeah.
That's interesting because. Oh, sorry. Have you got a page reference there, have you?
Yeah, it's on page 123.
Page 123, buildings. So the reason I oohed there is because I'm thinking openings for firing. Because does it have, if it's the top, well, it's just a wall basically. Because I've got some desert adobe buildings, and the top floor is just, it's got a little stone wall around it kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so there's no windows, there's no doors. So does it have 0 openings or infinite openings?
So this is in the section about orders to troops inside buildings. So it comes up in the main rulebook with regards to movement in and out of buildings and up and down floors.
Yep.
And in the context of movement, it says simply treat such flat roofs as the uppermost floor of the building. Now, the previous sentence is some buildings have a flat roof which is accessible from inside the building. So this is a particular instance where you've got, a flat roof that you can only access from the building and the floor below. In that instance, from a movement perspective, you treat it as though it's the uppermost floor. I guess to answer your question, I would treat that as open so that any number of models can fire rather than the limit of 2 because it's not a window or a door. And I'd also say it gets hard cover because it's there's a low wall to hide behind.
And are you treating them as inside the building if they've gone up to that top floor?
I think I am, yeah. But just to complicate it, you see some of these buildings where there's an external staircase.
Well, before you get onto them, because I was going to ask you about them, because that's what mine are like. But when you're on the top floor, anyone can shoot out. You can be shot at. You've got hard cover. If you're treating it like a building, I'm going to get extra protection, but I'm also going to get high explosive, like roll the dice hits rather than template hits. So is that what we're saying? It's top floor of a building like that. Those Adobe buildings where they've got a little loft hatch, if you will, in the middle, which is where they always fall off and I lose my dice down them. If it's one of those ones, the unit on top is just in a building and I don't have to worry about templates and stuff and placement because it's just in the building.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then now the ones with the staircases, they're the ones that I've got. So I'm interested to see what your opinion is on them.
So I have played it both ways, i.e. I've played it, as I've just said, whereby the only way to get up onto the roof is through the building, i.e. from the floor below.
Yeah.
I've also played it at events where my opponent has said, oh, no, I can run up the stairs on a run move onto the roof, and they're not on a building, they're just behind hard cover.
Well, I'll tell you how I've played them. The way I've played them is a bit like your second way, where you basically just move them up the staircase as though it's open ground.
Yeah.
And then in order for them to shoot out, they push up against the wall and just treat that as a hard obstacle. Now, the reason I'm thinking I prefer your version where what I'm thinking I might do is that terrace, I might treat that as a building, and the only opening you can access it is the staircase. So we treat the staircase as the door.
Okay, yeah.
And that's for access. I think for shooting, you can still shoot out and shoot in with all your troops. That's fine.
Yeah.
But the reason I'm thinking that is because I did have one really interesting case come up with the way I play it, where it's just open ground, where I had a squad on the ground beneath the building. Yep. They had their sniper sort of on the opposite side of the building on the roof. We're about sort of 5 inches apart as the crow flies, but I can't charge them. Even though my squad has all the range to charge them, I can't charge them because actually they can't see each other.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Which is really bizarre because they know the sniper's up there because he's been shooting at them. They've fixed their bayonets. They're ready to charge. And then at the last minute, they've somehow forgotten that he's there. And so actually, if I treat it as a building with the door being the staircase, that fixes that problem because you can see the staircase, you can charge in through that, can't you?
Yeah, that's a nice way of doing it. Yeah, so your access point is the bottom of the stairs for the purpose of being able to run into it
or run out.
Or run out. Yeah. So the normal rules apply about entering a building on a run order. You've got to be within 12 inches of the opening and everyone's got to get, within 1 inch of that opening. Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way of doing it. Yeah.
Because the other problem I've had, actually just thinking about it, the other problem I've had playing it the way that I've played it, which is probably wrong, is high explosive shells. Same howitzer shoots at it indirect.
Yes.
Now, with a building, you have that thing where you roll and on a floor, it explodes on that floor and then it falls through the floors.
Yeah.
I've had that exact situation where if we're treating it as open ground, is it going to fall through or is it not?
Yeah.
All that sort of stuff.
If you played it like you said, so the top of the building is open ground and therefore you're using a template when you fire HE, strictly speaking, if you follow that through, you're not rolling to see if that round explodes on the roof or goes down below. And if you're not rolling, then you've just created a impenetrable, bunker at the bottom floor of that Adobe building that cannot be blown up by indirect, HE.
Yeah, exactly. Well, unless I choose to. So it implies that my I've got smart shells basically that know exactly when to explode.
This is World War II though. We're talking
in 1942. Yeah, exactly. So it's a weird one, and I think going forward, I'm going to recommend, because this table, to be honest, it tends to be a table that I play on that often, because it doesn't really fit most of the armies that I've got, and I think I will be recommending going forwards that you treat it like a 2-story building, but to get onto the first floor, you use the stairs as a door, basically. And I think that nicely solves all the problems.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, as long as both players agree and if you've lent it out for someone to use at an event, if the TO's happy with it, then crack on with it. But yeah, it is one of those interesting ones, isn't it?
Yeah, there was just two things that sprung to mind while we're on buildings, just some pro tips for you here. One of the things that's missed in the book is if you start in a building, you can knock an extra opening in the wall.
Yeah.
And that's often missed, isn't it? Used for spotters quite a lot, where you put them in. The building has windows on the two sides facing the short edges. You want to put your spotter in so you can see the long edge. Well, as long as he deploys in there, he can punch a hole in the wall, can't he?
Yeah, it's the same with snipers. It's the same with artillery as well.
Yeah.
Machine guns, medium machine guns, if you decide to take one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was my first thought. And then the second thought, the high explosives don't need an opening. You can just fire it at the wall, basically, because it's going to go through. When firing a high explosive weapon over open sights against a building, simply choose a unit you're aiming for, regardless of whether the gun can see any openings. You're literally firing at the walls of the building itself.
They got FAQ'd.
Did that get FAQ'd?
Yeah.
Here we go to the 60-page document.
Because there was this whole piece in it. It's on the first page of the FAQ. So it's page 124, 125. What it got FAQ to was, this means that when rolling to hit, you ignore any to hit penalties for cover. Okay, because you're firing at the building rather than the unit. Yeah. However, all other modifiers apply as normal. For example, down in this case might represent the unit hiding in the building. And if the enemy misses the shot, this might represent them not having taken the shot at all, and instead still be searching for the target, blah, blah, blah. So what the FAQ did was basically say, yes, you can target a building which has a unit in it. However, you do ignore cover, so you don't get the +2 modifier for hard cover, but you don't ignore things like down.
Yeah, but you still don't need an opening. So it's only flamethrowers and small arms that need openings.
That doesn't make sense.
What do you mean?
Because you're firing at a unit in a building and you don't need an opening. Yeah.
For high explosive.
For high explosives. But then your unit goes down, which does make it harder to hit because, for example, and to quote the FAQ, this might represent the unit hiding in the building, and if the enemy misses the shot, this might represent them not having taken a shot at all and instead still be searching for the target. Yeah.
Yeah, they've lost their confidence that there's anyone in the building, I suppose.
But they were never looking for a target. They were just looking for a building. Oh, there's a building. There's a unit inside. Bosh.
Yeah, but I would personally ignore the flavor text from all FAQs because they just add nothing. It's like when they changed the flamethrowers against the building thing. So this is a bugbear of mine from the FAQ. This should be a segment in its own right, shouldn't it? Johnny complains about the FAQ.
Yeah. How long we got?
So it used to be, when you flame a building, there's a 50-50 shot that the building just sets on fire, and then the building's destroyed, and the unit inside make an emergency disembark, as though disembarking from a destroyed transport is what the rulebook says. Somebody sent the question, well, does that mean they take damage and then consolidate D6 and go down? Or do they just do the emergency disembark, go out? But because the rulebook specifically says, as though from a damaged vehicle, it's quite clear that they should be taking damage, both from a games mechanics point of view, rules as written, but also thematically. If the ground floor is on fire, there's a strong chance you hurt yourself trying to get out of that building. And then what they did was they said, in the FAQ, the answer was, you don't take damage, you just disembark, regardless of what floor you're on. And the first version of the answer, they literally ended it with, fear gives you wings.
Yeah, fear gives you wings.
I was like, that wasn't, it was both unnecessary and also doesn't add anything at all. So that was really quite annoying. And it still annoys me because if you're on the 5th floor and someone sets a building on fire and you have to get out fast, there is a strong chance you're going to hurt yourself. But que sera, the FAQ changed it. What it does mean, though, actually, on a positive note, is... are you allowed to do this, Phil? You can tell me if I'm allowed to do this.
Okay.
My unit are in the building.
Yeah.
They've activated this turn.
Yeah.
They're on the 3rd floor.
Yeah.
The objective is 2 inches from the building.
Yeah.
It's the last turn of the game. I need to get them out. The flamethrower is behind the building.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to flame the ground floor, set the building on fire, and then they just fly out and land on the objective? So my query there is, am I allowed to target a building if my unit's in it?
No, because it's not an empty building and you can't target your own unit, can you?
So what I need to do in that situation, if my unit's on the 5th floor,
Yeah.
I need to lure my
You
opponent
need to
into the
encourage
ground
your
floor.
opponent. Yeah. Or you need to bait your opponent to flame your building so that your unit can jump out with their wings slightly charred,
Yeah.
float down onto the objective, turn 6, pray there's no turn 7, bosh,
Job's a good one.
job's a good one.
Here's a question for you, Phil.
Yeah.
If I am shooting at a building
Mm-hmm.
and my opponent is on, let's say, the 3rd floor,
Yes.
do I measure my distance horizontally for my range, or do I measure it diagonally to the opening from the, I don't know, the base of the model, the head of the model?
You measure to the opening.
And that includes vertical distance, we're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's specifically stated anywhere.
I think it's a combination of earlier on in the rulebook where it talks about hills and
Yeah.
line of sight and hills, and there's a diagram, isn't there, of the ruined building, and it shows you that you can't see through the ruined building because it's ruined and therefore it's a big blob and blocks line of sight. So there's a whole piece around there about diagonal line of sight, effectively.
But that's only 2-dimensional on the ground, I think.
And then it also says later on, when you're firing at a building, you measure to the opening. So you measure up to the floor you're firing at and the opening on that floor.
Yeah, you see, for me, all of the diagrams and all of the measurements are only ever made 2-dimensionally on the ground. And I'm not sure the bit in the... I'm going to have to... if anyone listening can find a place in the rulebook where it talks about measuring distances vertically, please do message us, let us know, because I have a strong suspicion that Bolt Action was intended to be a 2-dimensional rule set where everything is measured 2-dimensionally. And that's one of the reasons why ruins don't have levels and you are always on the ground. But I do also think, as much as it's implied, because every measurement is a 2D measurement in the book, I don't think anywhere in the book it's specifically stated that it's a 2D system.
I think we've had this conversation before with Mike Smith.
Did we?
Because this rings a lot of bells, yeah.
Yeah, I just don't know if we had it on air, as it were.
No.
Right, I think I've discussed everything I wanted to discuss when it comes to terrain. What about you, Phil?
I haven't finished the buildings yet.
Oh, tell me more about buildings.
Okay, so as well as the ruling about roofs and whether or not it counts as another floor, other two things to be aware of when you're looking at buildings from a terrain perspective. Mm-hmm. First one is the number of rooms per floor in a building. So it says in a rule book, it recommends roughly each room is about 6 inches by 6 inches and no more than 8 inches by 8 inches.
Yep.
This is on page 123. This is particularly relevant when you're talking about churches, for example, because quite often most of the church buildings that you see from the major manufacturers, you often have that big, massive open area, the heart of the church, as it were. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes you might have, the nave or the chapel bit or whatever it is. It's also relevant for factories. If you have a intact factory that's not a ruin, is that part of, is that internal part of the factory one room or more than one room? And the reason why it matters was a number of reasons. One is to do with only one unit can occupy one room at a time. So if you said, for example, that your big church representing, San Mary-Glees, the Church of San Mary-Glees, is one room, that church in real life is massive. It's probably, 30 meters or so long, and probably about, 15 meters wide, 12 meters wide, something like that.
Oh, easy, yeah.
But if you can only put one squad in there, you can have a single spotter in there occupying that entire area going, no, you can't come in because I'm inside this one room. So it has an impact in terms of, placement of units. It has an impact also in terms of moving through rooms within a building, because obviously to move from, one floor to another or from one room to another, it's on the run order. Yeah,
and can you go 2 floors per turn or just one?
I think you can run up 2 floors, can't you? Yeah, up to 2 floors. And there's another line, and it's a throwaway line in the rulebook, and again, it's on page 123, which it basically says that you shouldn't be able to run from one section of a building to another section of building more than the maximum distance you could move. I.e., you shouldn't really have a room in a building that is bigger than 12 inches because otherwise you're teleporting from one room, and you're teleporting to the room next to it, which happens to be 16 inches away, but normally you could only actually run 12 inches.
Yeah.
So I've mainly seen it with things like churches and factories, basically.
So with the smaller churches where they have, so I've got one where it's got a big main middle bit where the congregation would all sit, etc. Then you have the bell tower at the front where the entrance is, and then you have a little, I don't know, at the back, another section of the building at the back. And that one very nicely splits into 3 parts.
Yeah.
And I run it as 3 parts, and it works wonderfully because each of those parts has an entrance. Brilliant. There is a certain size of building, like that Stalingrad factory I built, because that factory, I deliberately wanted it to be massive, and it's something like 3.5 foot wide, I believe, and sort of a foot deep in the other direction. At that point, I'm not splitting it into buildings anymore. Once you get to those sort of scales, what I tend to do is say, let's play it as dense terrain, and then it's much easier. Or let's just play it as walls.
Yeah.
The walls of the building will just play as hard obstacles, basically. And that's a lot of fun. The only reason I say to play it dense is because then if it's just walls, shooting from one side of the factory to the other is no more difficult than shooting a unit who's up against the wall inside. And so I like to play it as dense. We do sort of house rules on that where inside the factory you play it like a mini table in its own right. So shooting in and shooting out, it's dense. But then once you're inside, you check your lines of sight again, and if you sort of crouch down behind crates, you're getting cover, but if you just stood in the middle of the factory, no cover. And so it's not true dense in that way, I suppose. But yeah, those massive buildings, definitely got to split them up.
Yeah.
For multi-launchers as well.
Yes, yeah, that's another good point, actually, for multi-launchers, yeah.
Because otherwise your multi-launcher can hit a 24-inch square if the building's big enough.
Yeah, you just plonk a massive church or factory in the middle and just measure 6 inches for any angle, any edge, and yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Anything else about buildings I need to be aware of?
No, so that's it for rules. So dense terrain, ruins, and buildings are the 3 key ones with regards to terrain for me.
Fabulous. Anything else in general?
Just a little amusing thing. Going back to my point about having tables that look nice. I quite like it when tables have little Easter eggs on them.
Yeah.
So you'll see something it's not obvious, it's not immediately apparent, and it ties in well with the theme. As long as it doesn't, have an impact on the game mechanics, I quite like that. So, the classic example is the little farmyard animals that you might see, scattered around the Normandy board, for example. I've been having a look online to try and find a vicar so I can have him at my church, because one of the boards I'm planning to do is a sort of 1940s sort of sea lion type British board with a ye olde pub, and the school and the cricket pavilion, because Charlie Foxtrot and Sarissa make some lovely buildings that would work for that. So trying to find a vicar that would go in my the doorway to my church. And the other one I found recently is a collection of Buddhist monks, and I really want to find a way of getting them onto my Burma board.
Brilliant.
So just little Easter eggs that just make it a little bit different, and just bring a little chuckle maybe. But you can take them off the board. When I've played on tables, with farm animals, you just pick them up and move the farm animals to one side, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, with yours, if they're going to be in the buildings, you don't even have to remove them really, because you just assume they're not there from the game perspective, because they're not getting in the way inside the building. No. So I think that's a nice one. Because I was going to say I'm anti-Easter egg because it adds no functionality.
Yeah.
But if it's not hindering,
if it's not hindering and interacting in that sense, yeah, leave my Buddhist monks alone.
Actually, on that note of little Easter eggs, I do enjoy sort of like a big billboard on the side of a house or a little poster, something like that. I do enjoy those ones as well.
So I've recently just downloaded and printed off some excellent posters for my Normandy buildings, which I got from the Rapid Fire website. I can very much recommend them. And it's little things like that which just make it a bit more interesting than an MDF building, either pre-painted or one that you've painted up yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've nicely wrapped up how to set up a table and all the things we're thinking about when it comes to terrain in Bolt Action. So thank you for listening. If you would like to buy some of our top-notch merch, please do head to tabletoptommies.com. You can also find links to all the places you can listen to the podcast.
Thanks again to everybody for all your comments and messages that we've received. Please continue to like, share, subscribe, drop us a message directly or put a comment on our Facebook post. We do like to hear from our listeners.
Thank you very much for listening. And it's ta-ta for now from me.
And it's ta-ta for now from him.